Good morning. This is John Kinch with Michigan Energy Options. Welcome to the second of 3 webinar conversations we're having this summer. I'm really delighted to be able to welcome a friend of mine, Jacob Corvidet, in a few minutes here, and he's going to talk about CO2, carbon, climate change, and all these kinds of issues. He is a native son of Michigan. I got to know Jacob probably a decade ago when he was with EcoWorks. He has since gone on to do great things at Rocky Mountain Institute, which I believe is the leading kind of think and can do nonprofit in the country in the energy sector. Before I introduce Jacob, though, let me talk about our third in this series of webinar conversations that'll be coming up in September. We are going to be talking to Carrie O'Neill and also John D'Agostino of Inclusive Prosperity Capital, which is a nonprofit finance institution that funds clean energy projects. And obviously, as people know on the call, that if you don't have the finance to do that, you can't do a project. So that'll be a great conversation. Let me just check for a second. Tom, can you move the slides along if you're able to do so?
Yep.
Yeah, there's that one. There's the detail on that one. And here's Jacob. So before I get to Jacob, though, let me just say a couple of things real quickly. Obviously, in these times, you can't talk about climate change and CO2 and carbon without also acknowledging the twin forces that are at play today, which of course are racial inequality and the COVID pandemic. So a lot of our conversation today will be framed in those terms. In fact, just this morning in the New York Times, the reporter was talking about how the Democratic platform, at least, is shaping up in the fall to have those two as its pillars in terms of what needs to be done with government's intervention going forward. Next slide, if you don't mind, Tom. This is what I call the carbon wheel of fortune. There's many ways you can talk about carbon. You can talk about it in terms of the sources by sector, the greenhouse gases that are created by the power industry, by transportation. You can talk about the technological solutions that exist, natural and working lands, for example, carbon capture and storage. You can talk about the markets that are emerging, especially around pricing, whether it's cap and dividend, carbon taxes, the policies that are in place and that we need so that we can make more change. And then lastly, the actions that we can take both in the near term and long term. So I want to ask Jacob to think about this, as well as the audience. Just think a little bit about what actions, near term and long term, that you think maybe are the most important to get at this issue, and also what perhaps is the best scale to be working at. Is it local? Is it municipalities? Is it regional? Is it state? Is it national? Is it global? Is it all of the above? So with that, I'm going to let Jacob say more about himself and his great work at RMI. Once Jacob is done with his presentation, what we'll do is we'll turn our cameras back on so you can see us, and maybe we can even turn the cameras on for those folks who want to ask a question of us. We'll see. But then we'll have a conversation. We really strongly encourage folks to be asking us questions in our question box throughout Jacob's presentation and our conversation itself. So with that, Jacob, welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much, John, and thanks everyone for coming by. I promise I'll keep this sort of presentation spot shorter because I'm excited to actually get to the conversation with John and with all of you. But thanks so much for taking the time today to log in and join us here across these screens of America. So just briefly, these are 2 books that I led the teams at RMI to create, Carbon Free City Handbook, Carbon Free Regions Handbook. And these were an attempt to really just start to distill down of all the many things people can do and all the many things people talk about. What are really the essential, transformative, but economically effective and beneficial things that people in local jurisdictions can do to actually move towards a carbon neutral world? And these are all based on proven existing examples. There's obviously other ways to slice and dice this, but it was a great piece, and it's really helped us launch now a lot of work we've been doing over the last number of years, actually directly supporting cities, counties, states, etc., on how to do this work globally, but certainly in the United States as well. So if we look at the next slide, I just want to say that there's even those books span a variety of things, and I think there's an even easier way to frame this, which is really, if we're talking about decarbonizing our economy, which is what we need to do, we need to, just to frame this correctly for everyone, what we need to do is actually cut carbon emissions roughly in half in this next decade. And then we need to get them to zero by 2050. And that's why some folks are calling this the decisive decade. This is the time, and there's a lot that is pushing against it that makes it look worrisome. There's also a lot that is actually surging forward with a pretty amazing momentum that makes this plausible. And I think, as tragic as the coronavirus pandemic has been, it nonetheless also shows that large-scale action is possible when faced with the need. So what this slide here is about is really just to frame up, there's a relatively simple way to think about, okay, what does decarbonizing mean for our economy? And it's really essentially 3 steps. First, we continue to accelerate towards 100% clean electricity. That's happening dramatically. The market's driving it. Coal is disappearing fast. Natural gas, initially many of us were proponents of like, yeah, switch to natural gas, it's cleaner, it's better, blah, blah. No longer the case. Lots of problems emerging with natural gas, and in terms of decarbonizing and in terms of health. And so, but the good news is the market's already winning here on the fact that clean electricity is already dominating. So you clean up your electric sources. Secondly, you decarbonize your end uses, and that is, transportation, buildings, industry. We electrify and make them more efficient. Obviously, efficiency has long been part of my work, long been part of RMI's work. But really, at this point, instead of efficiency first and then you figure out how to do things, we've got a new message, which is essentially electrify and figure out how efficiency supports that. Now, efficiency is still often the fastest, cheapest way to move towards an electric option, especially in a cold climate like Michigan's. But it's really electrify first. And then the third is working around enhancing ecosystems, making sure we maintain our lands, our natural features, our ecosystem services here to continue to capture and store carbon and pull it out for us. So that's really, it's a 3-part piece. If we look at the next slide, I just want to briefly look at drawing out that decarbonized end uses is a lot of where I focus my time. Obviously, we have a lot working towards clean electricity, but this industry is hard, but there's some amazing pieces starting to come through there. And then buildings and mobility are the big places to go. That as we electrify those, it moves. And the one thing I want to say quickly about mobility is that, yes, we have to have electric vehicles, not just cars, but bikes, scooters, etc. We need electric vehicles, but a lot of it's also about designing our communities so that you don't need vehicles just to do these things. There's a lot of other benefits to that. So just to dive briefly on some of these other pieces, I'm going to drill in on buildings. It's a space I'm particularly familiar with. So buildings are the #1 consumer of fossil fuels globally. This doesn't look like it in all the data when you just look at direct emissions, that is the fossil fuels burned within a building. But if you consider the power generation needed to serve those buildings and the construction materials that go into those buildings, you get a big stack. And if we didn't look at the next slide, you'll see when you put those pieces together, that adds up to 40% of global emissions. That's getting close to half. So it's a big space we have to dive into. And if we look at the next slide, I want to tee all that up just to drive home why this matters in a place like a Michigan context. So this is a chart looking just at the direct emissions, that is to say the fossil fuels burned within buildings themselves, primarily for heating. And you'll see that 10 states in the US are responsible for over half of the emissions there. So that actually helps us understand, look, we can be strategic about this. And if you see on the chart here, Michigan is #4. It's the 4th largest user of fossil fuels in buildings directly. And so I just want to drive home that what we do in Michigan can have a really significant impact for the entire nation and therefore the globe in this space. So there's ways to take this, what seems like a huge, massive, how do you even start to approach this problem? And we start to understand it well enough to break it down, get close, and see solutions move forward. So that was the basic gist I want to make there. Lots of other things that I'm excited to talk about. I'll just very briefly say that some of what we're exploring at RMI in terms of how to run these solutions are, yes, we're working on electrification in buildings. That's still a very new emerging space for most of the market, but it's moving fast. It's both how do we stop building new construction with fossil fuels, because the truth matters, it's cheaper to build all electric buildings than it is gas burning buildings. And obviously in a place like Michigan, that has to be coupled with strong efficiency, but that's good for everybody for all the reasons, comfort, health, sound privacy, etc., as well as bill savings. We're looking at finance solutions a lot. One particular project I've been involved in is we actually are now on the verge, it looks like things are good to go, nothing official to announce yet, but of getting energy actually incorporated into the mortgage process in the United States with Fannie, Freddie, et cetera. And from there, we can start to say, look, financing changes in buildings is not easy. It's only decarbonizing sector where we're expecting all the individuals to actually finance this themselves. When we wrap it into mortgages, that's financing that's already happening. And it's good terms generally, right? And so it actually becomes a very cost-effective way to make this happen without putting a burden on anyone. And then finally, I just quickly mention a lot of work we're doing with cities around renewables procurement, both for the cities themselves and to help the citizens in those cities actually do renewable procurement, because the prices are right, it's working and helping disrupt and break the cycle of you've got basically one choice. It's sort of a, you can have any color car you want as long as it's black, and actually providing an option here to bring a number of different economic models that help people purchase clean electricity and make that happen. And it's been very successful. We're seeing the rate of renewable adoption is just skyrocketing right now. So those are just a few flavors of things, but all towards that goal. How do we decarbonize? How do we understand the systemic levers that need to be touched that make this easier for everybody? And let me just stop there for now, and let's actually get to faces and conversations.
Thank you, Jacob. I don't think we can actually turn on the cameras to get faces of folks who are going to ask us questions. I apologize. We'll solve that technological glitch next time out. I always reminded how techie RMI folks are, so we're perhaps a little less so. I wanted to add a couple slides real quickly to what Jacob had to say. This is a piece I just was looking at this morning from nature.com, a study that has come out looking at various sectors of the economy and what has happened during the COVID confinement. And what's interesting, if you take a look at this, you can see that the residential sector held relatively steady. Power sector did a few things, but clearly the mobility sector, surface transportation, as well as aviation, considerably dropped. And we already know all this, right? That said, if you look at the next slide, as Jacob was pointing out, the transportation sector in terms of greenhouse gases only accounts for 15%, where the lion's share of greenhouse gases is coming from the built environment. So that's why RMI and others are focusing still on energy efficiency, as Michigan Energy Options does, but also taking a broader look and thinking about all those things that contribute to greenhouse gases and climate change. That said, let me just briefly point to Jacob's excellent handbooks he's put together, his team has put together, and just give you the categories that are tackled in this handbook: buildings, mobility, electricity, industry, land use, waste, and finance. And we can get into some of those details as we have our conversation going forward. Can you move to the next slide, Tom? So with that said, Jacob and I are going to turn on our cameras so at least you can see us. Hello. And also invite questions. Hey, Jacob, invite questions from you in the question box by clicking on that arrow. That said, Tom, do we have any questions already for
yeah, come through. So can we make existing buildings more efficient and then switch to electric heat pumps for heating and cooling? Do the economics work?
Yeah, so it depends on the building, as always, right? And as I said before, in a cold climate, we really need to make sure that the building is efficient before you electrify. Otherwise, the economics don't work great because you end up just spending so much on the electric bill at that point. So it becomes pretty important to do that. That said, we've long said, look, yes, you can do everything ideally through efficiency, and there's so much benefit there. The problem is it's not a turnkey solution, right? Anyone who's done this knows you end up talking to a variety of different contractors in most cases. navigating a bunch of different things to figure out how to do it as a holistic package. There are contractors who will do that as a holistic package. That's great. Use them if you want them, but it's not how a lot of people approach this. And so it ends up being a convoluted space. Given that, I think there's a lot to be said for understanding that if fixing carbon is your goal, electrify and then improve the efficiency. And obviously, you can do a smaller electric heat pump if your home is more efficient first. That's great. But the key thing is that people are often replacing their heating or cooling equipment when something breaks. And the decisive decade, right? You only have one chance to do that probably in this next 10 years. So whenever you're going to change it to electric. That's the key. And do it when you have to change things. Be ready for it. And the great thing is, if you replace either one, air conditioning or your furnace, and surprisingly, our economics look even better if what you're doing is replacing the air conditioning. That's the time to put in the heat pump because you're already spending the money on something, and then the incremental cost for the heat pump are less, and the economics work out pretty well.
Another one, Tom?
Yeah. So
can I follow? Wait, let me just follow up on that, Jacob. So in this state, as in others, and you know this, that we have very different rates across the 65 utilities that serve our population. We have, residential and commercial rates that are relatively reasonable, although they tend to be higher than we see throughout the rest of the Middle West. And then we have a few outliers in which the electricity rates are at or near what you pay for in Hawaii. And these are a couple places in the Upper Peninsula. So you have that twin issue there of not only a very cold climate, but also very high electricity costs. And we have been puzzling that one through for years ourselves and just trying to figure out, how you address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sequencing question here, right? The places where electricity is super expensive and the weather is super cold, right? You have a bunch of these Upper Peninsula places, might not be the place to start, right? Maybe those become an argument for let's wait till we figured out a few other things about how to do this and bring some costs down. The thing that I always have a little bit of a concern for, though, is who gets left holding the bag on all of the gas, right? Because the truth matter is the cost of gas is rate-based. That is to say, whatever the cost is for running the system across the whole state or across the whole utility territory, whoever's on gas is paying that cost for the entire system. So as more and more people move off of it, a smaller number of people are paying for that entire system, and gas prices are going to go up. And so it's watching for that, right, and seeing where that shift may happen. Obviously, right now, gas is pretty cheap in Michigan, and as you said, in a few of these places, particularly electricity can be pretty expensive. So I think there's a sequencing piece there for sure. That said, we've seen a lot of people saying, look, this doesn't, a lot of people still just not clear on, like, do heat pumps work? Do they not work? All this sort of thing. They work fine. They work in cold climate. We're talking to people in Alaska using them. And the opportunities there is just the efficiency becomes more and more critical at that point to bring the overall cost down.
Okay. Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, so another question here. It seems that cities and governments are just now coming to grasp with solar and other renewables in terms of policy and acceptance, which of course has carbon benefits. But how do you think local communities can begin to think about carbon given relatively slow adoption of these technologies by governments?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said about the role that people can have in pushing their governments to do this for sure, because that just helps everyone do it more. There's definitely lots of ways to tackle things like renewable energy on a small basis, a household basis or a neighborhood basis. There are some limits in Michigan as to what you can do with community solar. That's been moving, thanks John and others for getting motion there to make that easier, because that's really critical. The economics are there that it's, it is cheaper at this point to be producing power through renewables than it is through fossil fuels, at least at the utility scale. The prices get a little higher when you go to the individual level. So there's a lot to be said about doing this at scale, which is partly why community solar becomes a particularly important way to try to move these things forward. That's probably why I do push a lot for how do we get city scale or larger, county scale, township scale, state scale efforts happening here, because that's where the economics work best right now. But the prices are coming down fast. And the other big one shift to watch for it's coming is that we're seeing more and more utilities around the country moving to time of use pricing, because they have to deal with how they manage their energy loads. And time of use pricing quickly starts to make battery storage really cost effective as well, whether you have solar or not, but especially if you have solar. So those are a few things I would look for. I don't know if that's getting exactly what the question was hoping to hit, though. John, I don't know if you had a thought there.
No, I agree. And I think, again, looking back at your handbooks, you emphasize DERs. You're emphasizing responsive rate design by the utilities, and maybe you could even talk a little bit more about that, as well as also response rate design is also responsive grid. We had a good fortune of talking to Gretchen Bakke, who wrote the book on the grid called The Grid, and I think some of these regional solutions are going to definitely include some kind of upgrades and modifications and modernization of the grid to make that kind of thing happen.
Yeah, and I think, obviously existing structures, the existing road infrastructure, existing buildings, all that is where the bulk of our stuff is that we need to look at. But part of the piece is we need to make sure that we're not building it wrong in the first place. And I think that's where watching for a little bit of future proofing becomes really important. These changes with responsive rate structures, what's happening in the utility sector is going to change what's happening on our roads and what's going to happen in our buildings, whether we want to see that happen or not, right? From the building sector, it's going to happen because the utility structures are changing. They're going to have to change. That's just being driven by market forces in a way that's going to sweep this along. And so what you don't want to do is start building something now that has to be retrofitted tomorrow, right? And that's the danger we're trying to watch out for. And I think for the existing buildings, there's a different economic place or roads, structures, any of this, like what do you do? But we want to make sure we're not keep throwing good money after bad, right? So we watch for where are the opportunities to make this switch whenever possible, and recognize that the world of energy is so essential, but it is changing very rapidly right now. And I think what we don't want to do is get caught behind where things are going. And I think this is true in a regional scale within Michigan, but I think about this a lot on a global scale as well, right? If the US fails to figure out how to engage deeply enough in this space, we're really going to be left in the dust. The sheer scale of what's happening in China and India especially dwarfs what's happening in the US around a lot of this technology development. And I don't think we want to be left behind there. And part of that is the continual drive to keep pushing forward, figuring out where is the future headed and how do we get on top of it now.
Sometimes in conversations with people, when I talk about renewables, they tend to think of it as a one-to-one. So in other words, we replace that many megawatts that's natural gas, CHP, or coal with that exact amount of megawatts in renewables. And that's not the way it's going to work. What's going to work instead is going to be smart systems and grids that can flex. It's going to be time of use pricing. It's going to be any number of these other kinds of things, conservation, energy efficiency, to make that kind of thing work. So it isn't necessarily just creating a world in which we're going to have nothing but wind turbines spinning somewhere near our houses. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I remember very vividly the book that Amy Lovins came out with, and you folks came out with at RMI some years ago about small is not beautiful, but small is something.
Small is beautiful. Yeah.
Small is beautiful. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
It was really about changing the entire thinking and system of how we think about energy and electricity.
Approach. Yeah. This is. It's interesting that we see the scales running in both directions, right? There is definitely, as I was saying before, like a need with renewables. Right now, the larger scale deployments are where the cost is really sweet, right? And so we start to find ways like community solar that you get both, right? You get a larger scale development of solar, but a smaller decentralized way for people to participate in it, right? And I think that's really powerful. And it's one of the things that is part of the defining era of our age right now with a lot of the technology and the digital technology is you have these platforms, these digital platforms, right, that allow massive participation by individual actors. and crowdsourcing, all these sorts of things. And so I think we're seeing energy move into that space as well. And so that gets to things like community solar. It also gets, as you're saying, to grid integration, right? Where you can actually make a building, make a car an asset to the grid, right? So that it is able to shift through these smart controls. Look, we can heat the water later because there's a big spike right now. And this is the thing, right? In utilities, we're all collectively paying through our rates for just the peak uses of energy. And if you can use these systems to bring down that peak, that's actually economically beneficial for everybody. But it's the individual actors that do it in this very loose, self-organizing way, which is what nature does, which is what capitalism does at its best. And what we're now, but the old energy systems were very top-down, monopoly-driven, and that's the piece that's really going away, right? So that all these individual pieces now become part of the puzzle in a way that's much more self-organizing and opens up a lot of new opportunities. And I think it's pretty exciting about what's possible there. But I don't know where everyone is here on the call, but there's always the danger from this wonky perspective of like, oh, well, this is how markets work, and this is how the energy systems are going to become smart. I always try to stay clear, like the ultimate goal here, though, right, is that we have homes, communities, ways to get to services, transportation, et cetera, that are cleaner, that are healthier, that are cheaper, are affordable for folks. This is the goal, right? And this is about actually improving these fundamental baseline quality of life issues for everybody, which may start to get us back into this equity question, right? Which is really critical. But right. I just want to stay clear, like when we talk to cities now, right, we talk a lot about the carbon benefits. These books are named, the Carbon-Free City Handbook, Carbon-Free Regions Handbook. And there are people driving that piece because we have no choice but to do so from a risk management perspective. But the truth of the matter is policy moves and people make decisions in their lives not based on carbon, right? In the same way they used to always say, like, I've yet to meet a single person who makes major life decisions based on what's happening to a polar bear. What does matter is health, safety, economics, these things in our lives. And the good news is that this is all beneficial for that and it's all going to make it better.
Yeah. So let's talk about the just transition. Let's talk about some of those concerns that some of the way we're heading with clean energy and some of the perceptions that are out there, the wrongly so, that clean energy is going to cost more for everybody, and also that it's going to leave folks behind, which we need to be so acutely aware of to make sure that doesn't happen. And to your earlier point, it needs to be something that's engineered at the front end, not somewhere in the middle or the back end. That's a nice to have. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I want to start by saying that people who are worried about that, I think it's an understandable worry, because the truth of the matter is people who do not have a lot of economic resources have traditionally been screwed over and over again on this front, right? And so if you're like, well, big change is coming, my assumption is that I'm going to get screwed here, that's a very logical conclusion, and it makes sense. And we actually need that voice to be raised to make sure that this happens right. I think those of us working in clean energy know and understand that this can benefit everybody. That's the vision, that's the possibility, but we have to know the difference, because any clean energy policy we're looking at could make things worse from an equity perspective. It could maintain the status quo, which is a mixed bag at best, or it could make things better. We have to know the difference and know which details drive it one direction or another, because it's absolutely right. You could do a full electrification strategy in a way that's going to just mimic all the problems that are there now, and that sometimes seems like the path of least harm because we're not changing it at least. But I would say, given that we have these real problems, and again, especially in the building space, right? I mean, the entire buildings industry is based on explicitly racist policies in the United States, right? Real estate boards that actually had their ethics, their code of ethics said things like, you should not sell a house to a black family in a white neighborhood. That's against the code of ethics, and you could actually be stripped of your real estate license if you did so. Right? I mean, this is explicitly racist piece, and that seems like it's all in the past, but it affects how wealth management happens now, what wealth is available, property values now, all this sort of thing. The world we're living in today is directly affected by those things still happening. So I think the argument is we actually have to find ways to correct that, recognize that this was done wrong, so now we just have to own up our mistakes and correct them as part of this transition. And at that point, that's actually not only, I think some people in clean energy have worried that's going to slow us down. What we're finding, of course, is in fact it speeds things up because we're now actually solving multiple problems. This is one of the things Amory always says. It's actually a quote from Eisenhower, which is, if you're having a hard time solving a problem, make it bigger. Because you often open up a new range of solutions when you do so. And I think integrating equity into the clean energy transition is exactly a case of that.
Yeah. Good point. Hey, Tom, you got anything for us?
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions coming in, so thank you, everybody.
I'll shut up for a bit then.
So one that's come through is cap and trade has been discussed for quite a while, but has not yet come to pass in any meaningful way. Do you anticipate cap and trade becoming a reality?
I mean, I think it may in some places. I mean, it is in use in some places. It's a tool that has helped. I think at this point, I don't think most policymakers are looking at any carbon pricing scheme as the primary solution. It's really interesting. I've been a big fan of putting a tax on carbon, not to vilify it, but just because it's actually correcting for a market failure that's there now to not account for that externality. I do think carbon pricing in a variety of ways is going to be an important piece of the puzzle here, and yet it no longer seems like the primary driver. We've got the economics to make these things work without it, and it's more about what's the political will to move things forward. So I think it's fine if it moves ahead. It's appropriate to have some kind of market pricing, and yet the real politic right now is that the conservative bodies that first started proposing carbon taxing as a appropriate market mechanism to address carbon have now dug in their heels and say that that's never going to happen. And so I don't know if that's the piece to try to worry about moving right now.
Okay, thank you. Another interesting question that's come through, and I think it's sort of been touched upon already, but in the residential market, most homeowners are unaware of the concept of electrification. Are there examples of how to effectively educate and inspire people to take action to support electrification?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think is really interesting here is I think many of us still see the electrification of housing as this sort of new space that's like, okay, it's on the front edge horizon, and miss the fact that right now in the United States, almost 40% of new homes are all electric homes. And it's way more common than we think. Now, to be fair, most of that's in the south part of the United States where temperatures are hotter, right? And so the fact that you have a cooling solution that also can heat your home, which is what an air source heat pump is, makes more sense in a lot of people's minds, right? And I think it's less common in the northern climates. Although Maine is a major mover on this front, right? Maine has done a tremendous job moving the heat pump market forward, and they're obviously a plenty cold climate. So yes, there's an education need here. People just don't, the conversation's not been happening enough yet. We need to get people to understand it. The other piece that I think is really interesting to understand here is around the truth of the matter is, we also have this thing that ultimately people don't care how their home gets warm. They don't care where the light comes from. They just want light, they want warmth, they want those services. They don't really care that much about the equipment. And I think one of the biggest problems here, there's consumer education for sure, but I have to say, I increasingly am just calling out our friends in the contracting world, where for so many years I've had contractors tell me, look, if the customer demands it, we'll build it. We can service anything. And I'm increasingly just calling BS on that, because I have so many stories and examples of people who said, yeah, I went to my contractor and said, I want this. And they said, you don't want that. And I said, no, I want this. And they say, well, we don't have that. This will be cheaper. Or they say, no, it's not. I've done the math on this, but I want that. And they're like, let me sell you this other piece. It's going to be great. And it's partly because they're not used to it. It's partly they don't know what the crews that they have out there. It's not what they have in the truck. It's not what they can find at the warehouse. There's a big piece around the supply chain that I think really needs to be fixed here, or needs to get out of the way.
And in Michigan, at least, and you know this too, I think there's been a couple of important drivers for change in the built environment, and that includes the utilities, who are mandated to provide energy efficiency rebates and incentives. And also we have a couple of good financial tools in the state, Michigan Saves as well as PACE. And both of those organizations, I know, spend a lot of time working directly with contractors, and there's a good give and take there between them. So that's
part of the problem is the way the system's built, right? Like, we have all this money moving around these efficiency incentives, but you can't use it to switch from a gas furnace to a heat pump because fuel switching is not allowed. And that's, for historic reasons, that made sense, but at this point is a weird distortion of the market, right? Like you have these services and you're distorting it artificially to say you can't do this thing even when you want to, if you want to participate in the program.
And that is something that's certainly on the mind of our clean energy sector here in this state with the MPSC and those of us who are .orgs and .coms and all the rest. That conversation is happening.
Yeah.
Okay, so changing gears slightly, but we have a couple of questions on a similar theme regarding carbon sequestration technologies. Do you think they're viable, and what do you think their impact will be on consumer behavior? Do you think it might give people a reason not to change their behavior?
Yeah, I mean, but change behavior meaning like turn on your thermostat or whatever, I'm not so focused on here. I think if change behavior in terms of like what you want to install in your house, I don't think it should have an impact. Here's the thing, carbon sequestration, we're probably going to need it. It's great. We need to develop it. Let's move on it. Let's go. The truth of the matter is we don't have it now in any meaningful way. And as I said, 10 years, we need to cut carbon emissions in half, right? I'll come back to that in just a second. But in that case, like, why wait for, like, we need to develop that technology, yes, but we can't be waiting for it to come into place. We need to be making these changes now, and these changes already make sense. The technology is already here to do these other things. So waiting for the magic floating possibility out there is unnecessary. We need to make these shifts now. And the thing I want to make about the decisive decade bit is that the COVID crisis has really woken us up to like, holy crap, this was unexpected. This thing hits and everything is so disrupted. The economy's, torn apart, all this sort of thing. Lives are harder, all this sort of thing. And the unfortunate truth is that what we're seeing with COVID is just a tip of the iceberg. And we saw the Black Lives Matter protests, this sort of thing come on. People had the sense like, holy cow, how many things come at once, right? And then there was the story about the murder hornets, which fortunately didn't seem to materialize, right? But there's a sense like, we can only take one crisis at a time.
Yeah.
But the thing to understand is that what we're trying to do by curbing carbon is to avoid the fact that climate change will drive multiple crises at once. We have people dealing with droughts and wildfires and COVID all at the same time. We had the massive flooding, right? For those poor communities in mid-Michigan, that was not a climate-driven driven flood. But the point is we get multiple crises piling up on each other and it becomes too much to handle. That's what we're trying to manage risk for here. And it is, when we look back now and say, oh, if we'd done a few things a little differently, we may have avoided more problems with COVID. That's why we need to drive the carbon conversation now.
Right. So I'm looking at the time here. We're about 5 minutes out from.
Sorry.
No. 5 minutes out. So I want to do this. Jacob, is there something you wanted to chat about that we haven't had an opportunity to get with the time remaining? And if not, so I'll turn to Tom and ask him if he's got a couple zingers at the end to send your way before we sign off.
I think I've dabbled enough on a few things. I think if we just want to hit questions, that works great.
Okay. So Tom, okay. Go ahead.
Yep, perfect. So an interesting one that's just come in. Any thoughts on reducing food waste, since food production, distribution, consumption is about 25% of the energy portfolio?
So I missed the end stat there, 25% of which energy piece, I'm not sure. But food waste, yes, there's lots of good ways to do it. We have some of that covered in the book. There's new things happening. Actually, interesting, just in this past month, Vermont just banned putting food waste into landfills. It's a pretty major move in the US to say, look, these things create methane, which is a huge problem for greenhouse gas emissions. We have better ways to handle this. And it is true, like we can actually make better soil, right? Anyone who's a farmer knows soil is the gold that drives human existence. And preserving that food waste to actually compost it and turn it into soil gold is, again, it just makes more sense, right? So we should definitely find ways to make that happen. That said, when it comes from an overall carbon budgeting, it's not, even though we have huge food waste problems in the United States, it's not the biggest piece of the puzzle, right? And I would say buildings, electricity, and mobility are really the places to focus from a strategic point of view. But for people working on food waste, thank you. We need to make it happen. Great to go.
Okay, and as we're rapidly approaching the end of the webinar here, we have several questions that have come in asking about how to serve low to moderate income communities. Could you expand on your thoughts on ways to engage these communities?
Yeah. So most of my adult life was spent in the city of Detroit, and it's where I was born. So near and dear to my heart on this topic. And I think the first thing is engagement is a tricky word because often it means different things. And in many cases, engagement means you informed communities about what's happening or what the opportunities are. Occasionally it means you asked for their opinions. Rarely does it currently mean that you actually are relying on activating, engaging in the sense of partnering with to actually make things move ahead. And I think this is one of the big pieces here is to understand that what we need to do is actually create opportunities for lower income communities or other equity communities of equity concern to actually be participating in defining the solutions and moving things ahead. And that there's a wealth of ideas in those spaces to move ahead and to be tapping that experience and that insight in order to make it make the solutions better, right? As I was saying before, we often can create solutions that have unintended consequences. One of the ways to avoid that is you actually ask more people who are going to be affected by it, how does this look? Does this work? Does it not work? What works? What doesn't work? What are other ways we can do it? And I think that's, as just as a basic principle, is a really key way to go. And we're seeing, again, some pretty interesting pieces moving around that in a bunch of different spaces in terms of the clean energy transition. Lots of wealth of material coming out around solutions to this, to these challenges.
I think the other piece of that would be that while you and I have and others have been in the energy efficiency space for years, and we do know that improving buildings and so forth improve the quality of people's lives. The immediate and local impacts of climate change weren't there then, but they're there now, and they're inordinately affecting low to moderate income populations in all kinds of ways, and that adds, I think, a layer of urgency and awareness to what we're trying to do.
And there's this weird thing too, again, about like, well, what can we take on when trying to move this stuff? And I think climate change is still often seen as a very white issue, but the data is actually very clear. Communities of color care more about and are more willing to take action on climate change issues than people in white communities. Like, it's actually a bigger percentage of the population within those communities willing to take action to do this stuff. And I think partly because there's a bigger recognition that, like, oh, we're the vulnerable population that's going to get screwed here, right? So it's great. It makes sense. And so not working with the direction of those communities is clearly a huge failing. But I think we do also need to just keep looking at these systemic ways to not just maintain the world as it is now. Prime example, LIHEAP, low income heating assistance program, right? Federal dollars that come to the state deploys them. The majority of LIHEAP funds in Michigan are deployed towards paying off people's heating bills, right? People who couldn't pay their bills. And in some ways it seems like, well, that's good. The people ran into a problem, they couldn't pay their bills, we have a way to take care of that. Yet that largely ends up acting as a pass-through to the utilities and changes nothing for that household. It gets them through a temporary crisis, there's a need for that, but it doesn't make any long-driven change. And Michigan invests less than almost any other state in broader systemic changes that could use those dollars so that people aren't going to end up in the same problem the following year. And I think, again, especially in the COVID thing, we need to look at how do we make sure we're not leaving people in a vulnerable space so that every time something new comes along, they're going underwater.
Yep. And we could talk for a long time about LIHEAP. We won't, though, because we're out of time. But just to put a last point on that, Jacob, I think one of the other things that has to happen, and this is what good policy can drive, is more relevant, common sense, helpful financing, funding from various sources that makes sense in 2020, not what made sense in 1990. And we need that. It needs to happen.
Yeah.
So, well, hey, I hope I get to see you in person at some point in the Beltway sometime in the near future.
I hope I get to see a lot of people, but you especially.
Yeah.
you actually see people face to face more. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Again, thanks everyone for showing up. Really, really great. Sorry we didn't get more actual face to face time, but feel free to reach out with anything follow up wise.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you. And everybody who's on the call, this does get recorded and ends up on our webinar. You'll get an email notification of that. And we'll also put, well, I guess we'll put the link to those two carbon-free handbooks that Jacob and his team have put together, because they're really worth everybody having a copy of those. Jacob, thank you. Happy Friday. Have a good weekend.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks, everybody.
See you later, everybody. Bye-bye.